Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to let folks start to join here. All right, we'll give folks about 30 more seconds. I want to be really respectful of everybody's time today, knowing that this is being recorded and we will be putting it up on our website for folks to catch up or catch it later. Awesome. Well, let's get started. Let's dive right in. So welcome everybody to the first webinar in GamePower's Powering Blue in 2022 Talent in Transition series. My name is Allison Schwartz, and I'm the program manager at GamePower. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be hosting webinars with experts and veterans in our field, providing resources to the talent who are currently looking for jobs, and providing space to virtually network. You can find the resources and schedule of events on our website, gamepower.org. I'm going to try and put a few of these links into the chat, including kind of a starting with a simple resume writing guide. We're not actually going to be going over the basics today. We will get through some of them, but because we know actually there are endless resources on the internet and even within our movement about how to write a resume. So today, what we're really trying to do is hear from the experts who do the hiring, have been hired dozens of times over, to give you some insights into the uniqueness of getting hired in the progressive movement. So today we're actually welcoming a really amazing panel to talk about resume writing and marketing yourself. I'm actually going to adjust that and to say storytelling per our conversation in our pre-meet, because really crafting a great resume is telling your story. And of course, there's no better time to brush up on how to tell your own story than during a job search. So before I introduce our panelists, please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then use the Q&A box as we go to put in questions for our panelists. That's where I'm going to be looking for those questions because the chat can get a little bit busy. And we will have some time at the end. So without further ado, why don't we start with some introductions? I'm just going to start by saying that we are incredibly lucky to have this panel, and I'm so appreciative of them giving us their valuable time. So we're going to start with Britt Kokenauer, who is the Managing Director of Search at Grossman Solutions. Britt, do you want to take just a moment to introduce yourself and a little bit about your background?
Sure. Nice to meet everyone. Thank you so much, Britt Kokenauer, she, her. Have been an ardent fan and supporter of GAIN for many, many years. I got my career started in working on political campaigns all around the country. Did that until I had, my storage space in one state, my stuff at my mom's house, and decided I would settle down just a little bit more. Started my DC work at SEIU and spent a dozen years at Emily's List, including 5 as the chief of staff. Most recently, before I came to Grossman Solutions, I was on the executive team at Greenpeace and managed the grassroots organizing digital team and communications team. For the last 5 years, I've headed up the search practice here at Grossman Solutions. We focus on not-for-profit advocacy, campaign, and political organizations in the work that we do, and as well as some management consulting. I'm based in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just a couple streets over from the district line.
Awesome. Thank you and welcome. Next, why don't Chuck, we move to you, Chuck Rocha, who's the president of Solidarity Strategies. Chuck, do you want to take just a minute to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for having me. And Allison, as you can see, I got into the studio, so there's no background noise, so I'm happy about that. There was last minute moving around. Anyway, y'all don't need to know all that. I'm Chuck Rocha. I'm happy to be here. Hello, Amy Pritchard. Hello, GamePower. Hello, all my fellow panelists. I was telling somebody the other day, I remember when Amy came to me with this stupid idea of thinking that she could help a whole bunch of people and create an organization that could fulfill all the wants and needs of poor staffers like me and her back when we were younger to actually do this work. And my God, to see what it's become now, I'm really happy and honored to be here. And that's why I stopped whatever I'm doing, whenever they call me. I'm recording a podcast an hour in this studio to say, whatever you need me to do, I'm here. I'm the president and founder of Solidarity Strategies. We're the nation's largest Black and brown owned political consulting firm in the country. I have never been hired or had a resume, but I look at a lot of resumes. And over our career at my firm, we have hired 123 young Black and brown operatives from all across the country. And that's our claim to fame, is the diversity and the cultural competency of our campaign. And I'm really excited to be here and get started and be with my friend Lena.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, then moving right to Lena Tom, who's the president of Mezzo Solutions. Lena, do you want to take a moment?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Lena, she, her, hers. And I started Mezzo Solutions about 3 years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's been a fun old time, but we also, similar to Britt and Grossman, we focus really on hiring in this field of specifically around politics and social impact. And a lot of that for me comes from my own upbringing and how I came into this work. I'm definitely very white passing, but I am actually Chinese, and I grew up in a family that was very pushed me around the importance of working for racial and social justice. So it really was something that was in me from a young age. And I sort of fell sideways into political campaigns and ended up doing data and analytics. So I have worked in data analytics tech for over a decade before I started Mezzo Solutions. And one of the reasons that I really became so invested in the importance of hiring and specifically equity was because I was looking around at my colleagues, and it was a very homogenous group. Let's be real, it was a lot of white boys at the time. And so that was problem one. And problem two was just the realization of like how unfortunately untrained our field is when it does come to hiring and these sorts of aspects. So a lot of what Mezzo does now is looks at thousands of resumes for sure, but specifically works with organizations in our space to hopefully help them be better at hiring and doing these processes and understanding how equity and things like racial bias, gender bias, ability, all these things interact. So I'm really excited to be here and talk a lot about in broad frameworks how equity shows up in these things or how it doesn't show up in a lot of cases.
Awesome. There's a whole other webinar for all of our
Yes.
friends who are hiring as well. Well, put it on the list of things that we should absolutely do. And then I'm just going to recognize that Amy Pritchard is here with us, but she's in the car, so driving from DC to Boston. So we want her to stay safe, and so she's just, I think, in listening mode. So I'd like to start basically with a couple quick level sets, and the first being, because this is a question I think that is on everyone's mind, is what do you all think folks should expect in terms of timelines for hiring in advance of 2023? And I'll just throw that out for whoever wants to start.
Well, in the political field, most of you just come out of this cycle. We all live through the cycle of campaigns, and all of us, as you get to a certain age, want to get out of this cycle and get into stable employment in something that fulfills you and you can make a living doing. And so as we move out of a non-presidential cycle into a presidential cycle, lots of things will move quicker now because everybody now is ramping up for the presidential cycle for the Republicans that will start almost immediately. They're going to have this big multi-candidate primary. That means that the Biden campaign will be wrapping up, but more importantly, other outside organizations, whether they're large nonprofits or unions or social activist groups that y'all would all be aligned with your values, be looking at that space, because that's going to start quicker than it normally would in an off year. And I'll turn it over to my rest of our panel.
Great. Others' thoughts on timelines? Lena.
Oh, I was saying, go ahead, Britt, because you were muted.
So I would say from an organizational perspective, and as we hit the holidays, one is just to encourage folks to be patient. So it does really slow down here at the end of the year as organizations. I think sometimes if they're, into a process, they'll continue it, but it's just really hard from a scheduling perspective to make those hires happen. I often tell people who are looking, if you're thinking about how long you're in your job search, don't count these 6 weeks kind of between Thanksgiving and the end of the year holidays, because it's not it's not the most, the easiest time to find, and don't feel frustrated. Just know that it's slow. I also think some organizations have been waiting, like, right, to figure out what was the composition of the House and the Senate going to look like, and what does that mean for their hiring and their strategy. And so they're taking a little time to figure that out, kind of recouping from the election. So I would definitely say, keep an eye, keep a lookout. Sometimes it's a nice time to be able to network because people are, a little more flexible around the holidays, but also sometimes they're busier because it's the holidays. So just have a lot of patience at the end of the year. And I think you'll start to see things pop a little more post the, second week of January.
That's helpful. Lena, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, the only other thing I would just add is with that all in mind, again, it may, as you're looking at job sites and things, it may seem like there's a trickle of jobs right now. And then at some point, February, March, April usually is like the floodgates open and all of a sudden there's tons of jobs. So just having been in that post-election cycle, we're like, well, I'm unemployed and I need a job and a paycheck right now. Easier said than done. But if you are in a financial situation where you can, figure out what are other temporary short-term modes of employment. I know, like, I always had a fallback job that I knew I could kind of go to, or like get a job at the mall. It's not the end of the world for me, at least. That was my situation and I could do that. And what it allows you to do is to be able to wait. Because I think sometimes, it can feel understandably stressful, and knowing that we are on a timeline of this little bit of a quieter time. So just something I would encourage people after this is to just kind of take a realistic assessment of where you are with your needs and your finances, of like, how do I get potentially through a few months before the kinds of jobs I'm going to be interested in start showing up?
Absolutely. I always did temp work.
Yeah.
And one more area to level set, because we're going to get into some questions. And I think that folks on this call may disagree with each other. So is there only one way to write your resume for, the progressive political space? Lena, I'll start with you because you.
I know, just emphatically shaking my
Oh, you're
head
muted.
no. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Just emphatically shaking my head no. I think this is the biggest thing that I hear and see, is that if you ask, 100 people how to write a resume, they're going to have 100 different preferences. Some people like objective statements, some people don't, some people like, in timeline, there's a million things that we can say and do. And so I think it's really, as we sort of talked about at the top, it's about formats and ideas and things that tell your story best. So I know we're probably going to get into that more, but when you're thinking about trade-offs of all the things you could put in your resume, it's what really emphasizes my story, my interests, my values, my mission. Because I do think that that's one thing that I will say that is a somewhat commonality, is we really like to understand, like, why is someone applying for this job? Why are they interested in this work? Have they done similar work? Have they been in sort of mission issue, political advocacy work before? Like, why are they here, basically? Versus just like, hey, they might just be applying for every job. And that's fair too. You gotta have a job, unfortunately. But it is helpful when we're trying to make sense of a lot of resumes. Why are you here? What do you care about? What's your story? But yeah, we're gonna have a million opinions on what things to put in what order.
Yeah. Britt, any thoughts on one way to
I would just say, I can't tell you the number of times where someone comes to me for resume advice and I offer some about a specific thing, and they'll say, I just talked to someone who told me I absolutely should do the thing that you're telling me not to do. So to Lena's point, it is true. I don't know if curious Lena's thoughts on this. I'll say that in this field, I am not a huge fan of sort of the skills resume as opposed to the chronological resume. I find that my clients like to know what people have done. And so if that's a way you want to go, I think just keep it concise, because I think taking 2.5 pages to get into the jobs you've had, again, for my clients, that is for them is sometimes a bit of a challenge. So again, all preference, but that's, I'll throw that out there for me.
Yeah, I generally agree. I mean, people
Muted.
do still, I think I'm just delayed on mute. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I generally agree. I mean, I think the thing to think about is that unfortunately, the person that is looking at your resume is probably looking at it for a very short amount of time. They don't have a lot of time. I think Britt and I are the kind of people we look with more detail because it's literally our jobs to do so, but that's not always the case. And so, you know, in addition to just telling your story, I agree, like whatever makes it quick, pithy, gets straight to the heart of things. You know, I think people who have done things like, you know, someone said clarifying statement like skills over chronological. If you've seen like a more of a European CV style versus a more traditional American resume, that's a good comparison point. But basically it's the idea that like, here's the most recent job I've done, and then working in backwards chronological order, here's the jobs I've done. And like within that, here's what my responsibilities or my roles were, versus what you'll sometimes see with, say, I think you see this a lot with technical resumes where people will be like, here's the long list of softwares and programming and coding languages that I know, but it's not focused on the jobs that were had previously. So it's definitely something that I think is an evolving thing, but I think the definite agreement is like, people want to know where you worked before and kind of what that looked like. So hopefully I clarified that for the question too.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think there's a lot of ways to do things, but I think the one thing we can agree on is that there's no perfect or right way, but I think, you know, getting this advice from you guys who hire within the movement, and that's what people are looking for first, is really very helpful. I'm curious, kind of from all of you, because you guys recruit, you know, for a wide array of organizations, hire a lot of people, review thousands of resumes. What are the biggest glaring, I don't want to say glaring, what are the biggest mistakes that you see people make, or biggest things that you're like, oh, I just wish people would stop doing that? Typos, obviously, we'll just like throw that out. Please proof your resumes, have somebody else read it and review it. But tell me a little bit more about the things that you see.
Go ahead, Britt.
Okay. So I would say one is length, and I think this actually goes both ways. So I think if you are earlier on in your career, probably a one-page resume or something close is appropriate. I also find a lot of folks later on in their career who've been told they have to keep their resume to one page, and then they really, Lena, you might be like, you only love one-page resumes. And if so, for me, I find they discount a lot of their experience. And so once you've hit, you know, a certain threshold of having had enough jobs, I think you need to be able to tell that story. And if that takes a page and a half, then by my account, that's great. So I think the length is one piece. I think the typos thing is, I mean, I know it sounds crazy. I see people with like really senior leaders who have typos. And so just do have someone else proof your resume. I also really encourage you, particularly, I know we're going to talk about like if you're transitioning from one, you know, from electoral campaigns, you want to move into advocacy. I also really encourage you to have someone who isn't in that world read your resume and tell you if they understand what you did. Because if we, you know, for those of us who come from campaigns, we have a very specific language and we follow that, but not everybody understands it. So have someone outside of your space also read it so that you know that you're actually telling the story that you need to tell. I'll just pause with that.
Other thoughts, Chuck or Lena, about?
I was just going to say the same thing about the length. Like if it's more than 2 pages, like it's hard for me to read one page. So that was my only thing. So Britt took mine.
I'll add, I think this goes kind of to the length question in general, and you know, whether you've transitioned jobs and fields, you know, the longer you're in this space, or if you are a serial campaigner and organizer, as many of us are, don't discount that work. I think people apply to the rule of one page and like, crap, well, how do I fit all this on here? And I've worked on like 10 different campaigns. You know, even if it's as simple as like field organizer and a bullet point list of like all the campaigns you worked on, but the role was kind of the same. You know, we kind of understand if you're an organizer, we kind of understand what's engaged in that. Don't cut those off. And I think similarly for career changers. One story that has really stuck with me is I was working with a woman on her resume, and she was having a hard time. She wasn't getting any callbacks, all these things. I was like, oh, well, quite frankly, once I was on the phone with her on a video call, I realized she was a little bit older than I thought based on her resume. I thought she was like 22. Nothing wrong with being 22, but that's what I thought based on her resume. She had been a nurse for like 15 years, and she didn't have that anywhere on her resume. Do not discount those things. So if you are a career changer, like, it is helpful to know that you have done work and other things, maybe, again, to my thing about working at the mall, maybe I don't need to list my high school mall job, but the idea that you've been working for a long time, you learn a lot through those things. So I just want to say, like, don't discount other things. Like she had followed the idea. There's this idea that you only put what's relevant to the job you're applying to on your resume, but that can be a tricky line. So, think about, how do I sort of express really my life of learnings that may not be exactly, she doesn't need to like list everything she did as a nurse for me necessarily, but it's helpful to know that she'd been working for 15 years. That said a lot more about her than just her few years as an organizer experience, because it was a big change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're not talking specifically about cover letters here, but cover letters are a great place to say, I've been a nurse for 15 years, and the things I learned, I think, are really applicable to politics, to, this particular job. It's what brought me, what your passion is. I think getting back to the why. So don't, eliminate your why from be able to, again, to storytelling. It tells your story.
I do have one don't do thing to put on. This is going to seem like an obvious thing, but it still needs to be said, is don't lie on your resume. Everyone fluffs, everyone exaggerates a little bit, but this field of politics, we all know each other. Like, Chuck and I played on a softball team years ago in DC. Like, that doesn't make any sense, but that's like literally how small this world is. And so be real, just you can say what you did and what you worked on, but don't ever lie. You will be caught. And there are people I know who cannot get a job because they were caught out in a very obvious lie years ago. And people are like, well, now I'm not sure about them. Why did they lie about that? So seems up needs to be said, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly ways, if you have a red flag, something that would be considered a red flag, there's certainly ways to just come out and say that, I parted ways with this company earlier than I had planned because, it wasn't a good fit, or whatever it is. There's ways to talk about that in advance, so you don't leave the person who's looking at your resume with questions. So I think there's great ways to do that. Well, kind of on the reverse side, while there's some things definitely not to do, what are the things that for you guys really make a resume stand out in a good way?
One of the things that are everything about what I do in hiring is a little outside of the box of the stereotypical stuff, much like how I talk. So I would look at, I look for not as much, where'd you go to school and how many years of experience do you have? Because that's what people do in most jobs. But we all know if we wanted that job working in corporate America, we'd be having a different Zoom right now. But all of us are trying to change the world. We're trying to do good things. We're trying to be activists in our own way through our employment, whether it's working for a union or a nonprofit. So because my firm runs campaigns and does all these different parts of it, I look for what you've done while you were working or while you were in school, like the club piece, the organizing piece, what you were involved in tells me more about you before I interview you than what your experience level was working for congressional blah, blah, blah. Or if you're just coming out of college, like what were the clubs you were in? Were you in the Immigrant Rights Club? Were you Students Against Sweatshops? Were you that starts telling me you're an activist. That starts telling me that you care about your fellow man or your fellow sister. Like that's thing, I think that we don't take it with me. I can't speak for my other two panelists, but for me, I look for what have you been doing outside of work that you care about giving me what is the most precious thing from you, which is your time.
That's great. Lena, thoughts on
Yeah.
standout resumes?
I mean, strongly agree with everything Chuck just said. And I especially think if you are newer to the field, like just knowing that you volunteer on the weekends will make you stand out to me versus some, if I have to look at two identical resumes and I'm like, these seem fairly straightforward, I'm going to go with the person, if I have to make a decision, who it's like they seem engaged. This seems like it's really what they are about. I think the other thing too is this is going to get into preference thing, but I do think it really does stand out to me when when it's really clear to me like what you achieved in that job versus what you just did. So I think it's a really important distinction of, we can get into this resume that's just like, I answered phone calls and I set up meetings and I did da. What I want to know is, my job was to communicate to voters about this upcoming election. And I spoke to thousands of voters, whatever the number is, and, things that kind of like can convey what were the outcomes of your work. And I think that there's always outcomes, even for the, most entry level job or whatever you may have had, up to obviously very senior. And I think especially as you get more senior and more experience, then I really want to know what you did. Like if you were a director or something, I want to know like what were your outcomes? If you managed a team, like how did you contribute to your team's growth or your department's growth? What did you can like list some wins basically. So that's going to be really important as you go up, is I want to know like what did you actually accomplish, not just what you did in front of a screen all day pushing buttons, because we also got to do that.
Indeed.
I would just add, I love a clean looking resume that's easy to read, easy to follow. I think there are still a lot of hiring managers who are my age-ish, which means I'm wearing reading glasses. So don't make your font too small. There are sometimes like I want to be able to print it and read it, right? I print a lot, see it. I want to be able to print it and read it. So I think that's important. I also love when people include, I think a lot of times people will say they worked for an organization. I love when they give me a line about what that organization does, because I only know some small subset of what organizations are. So I like knowing what they are, giving me a little context. And I would just say, I think I want to go to Lena's point of like telling me what you did. And both how I love that. And I also think like, look at that with a careful eye. Like a lot of times I get some that will say like increased, like volunteer participation by like, 1,000 million %. And it's like, cause they went from 100 to 200. And so like making it be impressive, but realistic and also specific in that way too.
Great, that's helpful. I'd like to talk a little bit about matching your resume with the job that you're applying for. Do you recommend tailoring your resume every time? Is that, should it be something different? Do you change it? Curious what people think.
I was trying to see if Lena wanted to go first, see if we have the same answer.
Well, so I see Chuck shaking his head no, and I tend to also agree. I'm like, unless you're really applying for something that is wildly different than what you would typically apply for, it's probably fine. I do think that there's something to be said for, if there's particular skills that they are asking for, like, especially if it's like a software or technical skill, and you do know that, like, make sure it's in there, because it'll just be really easy for them to look and go, oh, okay, we need this person to know how to use the van. Yep. Okay. They know the van. Great. So I do think there's things like that, but as a general rule, like, make one good, really strong resume that you can lean on. And I usually feel like that's good. Maybe there's tweaks, always double check it before you hit send, but I tend to be on that side. Britt, I'm not sure where you land on it.
Well, I take it a little bit. I come from also when I was a job seeker, which is the energy to like redo it every single time. I just never had. It was too exhausting. I think so. The advice I give to people, I think the exception I would say is like, I've had times in my career where like there was a time where I was really looking at like communications jobs and really looking at sort of managerial chief of staff jobs. And I did create 2 core resumes for those 2 things. because they were so different and required. But then I just kind of kept those as the standard and would decide which of those to send in. And then the only other time too, I think if there's a job that like is really the job that you feel like is your absolute dream job and the one you really want, do spend a little bit of time on that if there's something you think you could do to tweak. But day to day, I'm totally with Lena.
Right, yeah. And I think also that for those of us who do hiring within the progressive movement, we understand where you guys are at right now. There is that, which maybe to Chuck's point, that's not how it probably works in the corporate world, right? But we understand where everybody's at. And so, yeah, like your time is precious and, put it where it really matters. I did want to follow up a little bit. If you, and this is for career switchers, we get a lot of folks coming through GAIN that they're looking to get involved in politics. And so have tremendous skills, but are trying to figure out sort of how to translate those into politics. Any advice for our career switchers?
So I see this a lot because there's not a lot of access points for Black and brown folks who come out of school who may not have come up through the free internship program of campaigns. And what I tell them is not to underestimate what you're doing in your current job, that is communications. What you're doing in your current job that is like politics and building coalition and putting people together to build a common system or a common thing. Because what you're doing is you're problem solving. And for those of us who've worked in campaigns, that's all we do every day. Is there's a different emergency every day. Every day there's a different.
I think we have a bit. I think we have a lag.
I love that.
Chuck.
Yeah, I love that we can see his very emphatic facial expression, but can't hear him.
I know.
Like,
Did you
what do you
lose me?
think? Yes.
Yeah, we lost.
It was
Yeah,
so good what I was saying.
I
It
know.
was so good.
Seemed really good.
Did you not hear it?
Um,
What I was saying is, if I could make it in one sentence, is don't underestimate what you're already doing in your current job. That's probably communications. That's already coalition building or politics. But just because it's not labeled that in a nice, quick, easy silo, you're probably already doing that. And when you have your interview, which we'll get to later, I know we're going to get to that, and that's where I'll come in, is that's big in explaining what that was doing, because that's a skill set that probably is relevant in the campaign world.
Yeah, I think I see a lot of career changers too. And I think similar to what Chuck was saying, I think before he got cut off is like, yeah, problem solving, comfort in like flexible sort of environments. Because I think another thing that we often are dealing with on these jobs is like, these are big, messy problems that don't have easy solutions. And so knowing that you're kind of able to thrive in that environment a little bit, even if it is, hopefully a more stable, manageable job, even in those kinds of organizations, there can be just things that we're not anticipating that come up. And so our ability to be flexible. So I think that that's really good. I will say on like a be cautious of or aware of is to be aware of corporate jargon, because Allison said very briefly off the top, like we have our own language, corporate has their own language. There is some crossover, but not total. So be aware of where things like acronyms and jargon come in that just may not be familiar to the person who's looking at it, because we just speak so differently, for better or worse. So even things as simple as like KPIs and OKRs, like that is everywhere in corporate world. And there's a lot of people in nonprofit and political space that are like, what's an OKR? So just something to be aware of, that those things don't always translate, and just to use more straightforward, clear language when you can.
I would just add to, I do think that both the points around exploring the field you want to get into and what are the skills that are required, and then really thinking thoughtfully about how do I show that I've had those skills, right? So for somebody who's been an ICU nurse, for example, right? Like, so you can handle pressure, you make big decisions. The decision you make about a volunteer phone bank is probably not going to be the thing that, saves or doesn't save someone's life. So being able to figure out how to take those skills and talk about it the way that they were, I think is really valuable, but figure out what the skills you need in the next job are, as you're putting together your resume and talking about yourself.
Great, that's helpful. I want to make sure I want to make sure we get to questions, but one of the things I really want to talk about is social media and the ability to use social media and even personal websites to continue to tell your story. So, a social media imprint or footprint, excuse me, can be, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, all of those, a personal, professional website. What kind of an impact can that have, good or bad, on your job search? Chuck, I'd love to hear from you a little bit on this one.
I took my headset off so we could be more in real time here, so I didn't have the lag. But social media is a big deal. Social media has become a bigger deal. I probably rely more on looking at your social media, going back to what are you doing outside of work, of like, what are you advocating for? I can tell you're in the movement. Is there Black Lives Matter, Save the Trees? We're going out this weekend to pick up trash at the lake. Come join me. That tells me about you when I didn't get to meet you, because you're out there pushing for all this stuff. Just like if there's inappropriate pictures there, or if you're talking about things that are just not very good, that's there as well. So I tell people all the time, like, if you're going to be in this, and I'm on social media, and my mouth, Amy Pritchard can tell you this, it gets me in more trouble than it's worth a lot of times, because my mouth sometimes moves quicker than my brain. So I say things that I don't think about, just like sometimes you post things that you don't think about on Twitter before you think about it for a half second. My staff, who puts a bridle in my mouth and their foot on the back of my head, says, easy on the Twitter there, big boy. We still got to get higher, right? Like, so I am the CEO of a large political consulting firm, and even me, I have to throttle. Amy would laugh right now since she's driving. I try to throttle the things that I say on social media because people see that. And that's a reflection of me when I then want them to hire me, because that's what I do every day, is I want you to hire me to make a TV commercial or a mail piece. So I'm in the same shoes you are. So that's reflected on my social media. Don't make light of it. It's a big deal.
Indeed. Britt, do you want to take the social media question?
It's funny. This is one where I feel like my employment attorney would advise me, because there are some rules about the evaluation of social media and hiring. That one, that is a high, as someone who hires folks, you need to be cautious of. But I would say, I think Chuck's exactly right. It tells a story for you. I do think I think of LinkedIn as the most boring of social media, even though I use it extensively. So you should have an up-to-date LinkedIn profile. Employers use it. I use it. I'm sure Lena uses it. People like to look. So even if it's, pretty simple, bare bones, you should have it. Make sure it's up to date. Make sure it highlights, there's a great place to just put that overview of who you are, that tells the things you want to tell about yourself and has your jobs. So definitely make sure that you do that. And I think think about, you probably will have people who will go back through and look at your social media for, some significant period of time. And so is it public? How much can you see? Be aware of that. If there's anything that, you'll feel like you need to explain at some point, please do. It also, I love when it really tells me a story about someone, that I didn't know. I do love that part of it.
Nothing more to add. Awesome. Well, and this is sort of, less about social media than, about professional websites. I've certainly seen some people use them to be able to go deeper, link to articles they've authored, designs they've done. I mean, there's a lot of people who do creative in our movement now, and that's only going to grow as we need more and more content creators. Which, as I've learned, takes a lot of time. So do folks feel like, is this a must-have in today's political job market or a nice to have?
I'll jump in because I think I see a lot of these, especially when it does come to creative and technical roles. So digital folks in general, whether you're an online content creator, whether you're behind the scenes coder, anything tech, anything data analytics. And, I do think it can be very helpful. I know, especially when we're looking for technical hires and things like coding, if someone has a GitHub that's public, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So it's just something to think about as you're building. And even if all you do is go, things like Squarespace, super easy, 10 minutes. Like I'm camping on my website that has like nothing on it, but it exists. It can be helpful if it, again, continues to push your story and your value. I know that one of my earliest jobs that I got, like my first like non-campaign job, part of why I got it was because I showed up with literally printouts of report formats that I had done. Because again, I was a data person, so they're literally spreadsheet printouts, but they looked really good. And part of it was I was able to put in front of people, here is how I can very effectively convey information to you, even though it's a report with a lot of data on it and a lot of numbers. And I think that that is truly what got me the job versus whoever else they were talking to. So I do think it can be a valuable tool. I don't think everybody needs one. I don't think you should stress if you don't have one necessarily, but if you think it's a way to be like, let me show my graphics, let me show what I've done, it's very nice to be able to have that quick link. I'll also say I am a fan of on resumes having that one thing on social media is that little LinkedIn icon. It can work through PDFs or whatnot, or just the actual link. Not having to go search for you is always good. Anytime you can make finding your stuff easy. So if you do a personal website, if you do whatever, make it very easy for us to find it. If you're giving us extra work to find it, we're not going to do it. Just we as a whole, it's just going to be difficult to get there.
Britt, anything on your end? Great. So one of the things I'm curious about, and Chuck, this is very much for you. We not all of us have as big a personality, and some of us aren't all that great or even hesitant to be active on social media, whether it's we're worried about putting our own viewpoint out, or we just have, it's pictures of our kids and our meals. Are there drawbacks to having a minimal presence on social media while you're job searching? I've certainly had people I've looked for and I can't find anything on them, and I get a little bit nervous. But one, is there drawbacks? But two, for the hesitant social media person, like what would be your advice?
Well, I'm going to marry one, and we talk about it all the time. She's like, you have more content than I'll ever need, so you just post my pictures for me. I'm talking about my fiance. And so I've done the same thing. And I'll be honest, when I go to search for somebody just to look at, I can't find them anywhere. I'm worried that they may be a mass murderer hiding or something, to be honest. And as Britt is shaking her head most time while I'm talking, I don't always follow all the proper protocols of an HR manager either, because I was an HR manager for the first 8 years of my 12-year career in my firm, until I realized there needed to be certain rules and regulations and a pool of applicants and all the things. Mainly it happened when I was running Bernie's presidential campaign, when literally we hired an HR manager and she said, "You've been hiring how?" And I was like, "People that I liked." And I was like, "Oh, I can't do that." So I tell you that you should have a minimum presence, especially on LinkedIn. If you're so shy that you don't want to be out there with your public life, and I respect that. And as I said, my fiance is that way. But LinkedIn is easy to have some presence of who you are, what you've been working on, and make it your professional profile. If you want to make a resume and you're looking for a job, it's the same thing, except it's online and it's called LinkedIn. So if you don't have anything else, I would say have that LinkedIn profile. That way people can see that you're actually a real person. And the number one thing is put your picture on your LinkedIn. They're not going to hire an egg that ain't no picture. And I know you're shy and you don't want to, but this is the one time I'm going to say, if you're going to have one, have LinkedIn, and I'll see if if anybody else has something to say.
Britt or Lena? I'm just going to speak because I know Amy's dying. She's itching to get in here right now to say, if you haven't Googled yourself, if you don't own AllisonSchwartz.com, which for the record, I did not, and Amy bought it for me. And I think it now goes to my company website. But it's just like a quick and easy thing. What are people seeing about you if they just write your name in, or write your name and a state they knew you lived in? So do a little bit of self-research, and, I would totally agree with Chuck. Have some sort of presence. It doesn't have to be everything. A lot of us are on some of these things for our families, and to stay connected and creep on the people you went to high school with. So we get it, but it's nice to have, some sort of professional presence online. So I want to make sure we're getting to some of the questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question. Is a gap in your resume, specifically during COVID or a career change, something that's a red flag and should be explained on your resume? I think this is a great question. A lot of people have gaps in their resumes. Lena?
There we go. I mean, I have a strong feeling on this on the hiring end that gaps in resumes are nonsense and we should not care about them. It's something I know I personally advocate very strongly for, but that doesn't change the reality of the fact that people look at those. I will say, I think specifically with the COVID era, there is a really big understanding that there's a lot of people with, especially 2020, suddenly your job disappears in March of 2020. We know why, right? It's understood, unfortunately. Similarly, I do think it's more common and understood that the elections just ended. Your resume might say job ended November 2022 and you don't have another job on there yet. Again, it's kind of understood. That being said, when you're thinking about those chronological gaps and those big things, it's if there is something that you're comfortable sharing, just so people kind of understand, especially if it was a school gap, school should obviously be on there. That should be clear. Things like that. And I have seen people say things even just like personal sabbatical, or a break for personal reasons, something as simple as that. So really, if it's only truly a big thing, I think generally people in our space are more forgiving of gaps. But if there is a huge one, you can just leave a line. I'll just say, just for all of you as advocating for yourselves, especially quite frankly, if you are a person of color or a trans person, you already face enough problems getting jobs and may have gaps in your jobs, in your resume. This is easy for me to say, but you don't owe anybody anything. You don't owe them an explanation. And from a human resources standpoint, you actually can decline to sort of explain that gap. You can just say something as simple as there were personal things going on, and so I was not working there at that time. You don't need to tell me anything else. So just want to put that out there and make sure that people know you don't have to share that info.
Britt?
I think one of the, I would say few bright, silver linings on COVID. I do think COVID changed the way people think about the idea of gaps in resumes. I think Lena was kind of alluding to that a little bit. I find that it feels just like much less of a big deal than it used to be, again, from an employer point of view. And so I think that's a positive. I also think that, what I do find, I find a lot of times in cover letters, so someone might say, I spent 2020 caring for my mother who had cancer, or they'll say something personal. If you want to share that, and feel comfortable doing so, who will say that. I do find, employers still sometimes ask if they're, about I think they're a little more interested in why someone left versus just a gap. And I do a lot of coaching with people who took time, not just because the job ended in 2020, but because they had their kids at home and someone had to be the one to manage that. And so I think that's shifted it a little bit as well. And also, I do think one thing that happens, I'll just say, in our space, is that because lots of us have done campaigns, we start our resumes or sometimes keep them where we are doing the months, right? So I did this job from June to January, or, June to November. At some point, you can let that go and just move to years. And then the gaps also aren't as noticeable, and you definitely don't need to account for a couple months somewhere here and there at all.
That's helpful. Chuck, any advice on gaps or Awesome. All right, we have another question. Do you have any advice on someone who's looking for a job that's disabled and needs to work remotely as an accommodation?
I have so many thoughts on this. One thing I think, again, thankfully, the COVID era has changed a little bit, and there are more remote, and remote optional jobs. I think, again, when you are looking at jobs, like it is perfectly fine to ask early, like, this job says remote, possible, like what would allow for that versus not, versus if it just says straight up like it is a remote job. A lot of the postings will say now, like, this is a hybrid environment or this is a whatever. So I think in general, people are relatively clear. But I do think, it is a challenge when you need an accommodation. Again, I would say, first of all, in terms of the hiring process, you can ask for an accommodation at any point during the interview process, but the employer cannot ask you about your specific needs until an offer is made. So like, I can't be an initial interview process and, ask you like, oh, you're disabled, do you need to work remotely? Like that is totally off ground. So I'm just saying, from the perspective of interviewing, that is in your wheelhouse. And so I hope that you would feel comfortable. I think I appreciate, certainly during early interviews, people asking me specific questions about, like, what's the work culture? Like, what are the expectations? Like, not just of this job, but like as a group, how do you all tend to communicate and work? Because I think that will tell you how much they actually truly have a remote environment, how much they've adapted to it, and are actually set up and ready to go and support you in that. And then I think, as you get hopefully further into the process, then you do at some point want to have a further detailed conversation about any other needs you may have. But just want to say, like, take it on yourself as like a resume and an interview process, in particular, the interview process is a two-way street. It's a conversation in both directions. And so you should hopefully be able to ask. And if they are giving you kind of ick feelings and you're like, I don't know about this, honestly, just get out of there. You don't want to be there. So, I mean, unfortunately, there's tons of jobs and tons of organizations in this space that are not good and do not support disabled workers. They just don't, unfortunately. So just something, walk away. You can walk away. You hold that for yourself.
Anybody else have anything to add to that question? Great. Someone wants to know, what's the best way to articulate a promotion you received in a company to catch a recruiter's eye? Put it on there.
Well, I think there's a couple different ways. And I would also say, I do think there's one question I get a lot from folks is, right, if you like started at an organization and you've had, say, 3 different jobs in that organization, how do you capture that? And so I think sometimes I see people use language where it will say, like, promoted to deputy director in first year. Or, right, you just kind of list it and it's very clear, right? So you might say, like on mine, it would say like Emily's list, and then I would list the 3 jobs that I had there with my overall year. So I think there's some ways to do it like that. Another thing that I think, if you're doing that I encourage people to do is have then your experience grow as well. So if I managed 2 people when I first started, I don't need to talk about that because I managed 60 when I left, right? So do tell your story, but be mindful of how are the ways that you capture the skills in those different sections.
The only other thing I would say in terms of highlighting that is just, it depends how different the jobs are, because in some cases it does actually make sense to almost like split them out completely. I had that when I was at the AFL-CIO, where I went from leading one team to like a director of a bigger thing. And I was like, there's no way I can encompass this all in one. So in that case, it's split out as 2. So it really just think about, again, what were your roles and responsibilities, the things you achieved. It might make sense to split it out. It depends, I think, is the answer on this one.
Hey, Mike, we're just setting up. Yes, we can hear you.
Hey, Allison, sorry about that. I'm fixing to log off because I got to do this podcast at the top of the hour. But I also, one of the things I want to make sure I got in here, and we haven't talked about it yet, is the importance to lean into your interviews when you do an interview about outside of just what you've worked on. In our work, telling your story matters. What makes you different? Did your parents immigrate from somewhere? Are they, what have they done for a living? What have you had to do to make it through to where you are right now? Most of us are poor. Most of us are working class. We're not going to work at Saks and down at Fifth Avenue or whatever the fancy words are. Hell, I can't even say it, much less work there. So if you think about it, this is the biggest thing. I thought that I had to act like everybody else. I've never been to college. I've got a criminal record and I was a teenage dad. I talk about that openly now because it makes me more relatable to this work that we're doing for public service. Lean into those disparities and don't be afraid to talk about them, because those challenges and what you've got done to get to where you are in this interview is a big deal to people like me, people like Lena, folks like us who are interviewing, because your real life experience makes up for part of that resume that don't tell your story. So tell your story. Thanks, everybody. Don't forget to listen to Latino Vote Podcast, which is recorded right now.
And Allison, you're muted now.
I've been muted, 3 years into this, I can't quite get off mute. I was just going to say, we're actually going to do a resume webinar in January. So we'll dig in further to resumes. I know that there's still a lot of questions. I just put my contact information in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me to post on the Game Power platform questions. The idea of Game Power is to be a community, to support each other. We're all going through or have been through similar things. And so, as we go through this, let's go through this together. We're all here. There's never going to be enough people in this business to make the change that we want to make. So there is space for everyone, and we all have to help each other make sure that we get to where we are destined to be. So with that, I want to let each of our remaining panelists just give sort of a final piece of advice or words of wisdom to our attendees. Britt, do you want to start?
Sure. So just a couple things. So one, if you're in the process of looking, I always encourage people. The thing I found hard about looking for a job is it felt like studying to me. Like you could do it every hour of the day, and that's not good for you nor for the process. So however you best structure yourself, right? I want to do 3 informational calls this week, or I want to work 2 hours every day at looking for a job, and then I'm going to put it away and go do something else. Set some structure for yourself. You'll be a better job seeker if you do that. Second is, I am a firm believer that a lot of times we end up where we need to be. It's hard not to take rejection personally. I always found that myself. The more I do this, the more I realize, right? The reason that, right, a place hires one person over the other, there's so many factors. Some, many of them have nothing to do with you. So just, keep that, remember that as you're going into it, that there's, lots of opportunities out there. And they will break, as we know, they're going to break over the course of the next couple months. And there's a lot of folks out there, GAIN is sort of the culmination of a lot of different programs over years that helped people and who want to mentor and help you, myself and others included. So don't hesitate to take advantage of that.
Thank you. Lena, some parting words and advice.
Britt took the words right out of my mouth. I think it's so easy to get disheartened during the job search. I think before you worry about writing your resume and doing all that, shore up your support system, whether that's your friends, your family, community, other campaigners. Build that up, because it can be hard emotionally, and those no's can hurt sometimes, and just take care of yourself first and foremost. That is definitely the most important thing. And then the other thing, just as we've said repeatedly and reiterated, there's no such thing as a perfect resume. I've never seen one. I don't know what it would even look like. So just, again, be easy on yourself when it comes to that too. Do your best to tell your story, get some friends, family to look at it. And similarly to the job search itself, put it away. Don't stress over every word, every line. It's not going to ever be something magical. So, you know, it's a process and you'll get there. And, you know, if you weren't here, we wouldn't, we do this because we believe in it. So we know it'll all work out.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. Thanks to everybody who joined today. I'm just going to point out that on November 29th, we're doing a networking webinar with Teresa Vilmain and Georgia Aguirre Sacasa, and maybe some others. So everybody wants to know, how do I network? What should I do? And so we're bringing in some really good networkers. And these are not people who live in Washington, D.C. So anyways, thanks so much to everyone. Have a wonderful rest of their day, and please don't hesitate to reach out and use the Game Power platform. Bye, everyone.